The past is not a single story. It is not merely the grand narrative of empires that won, of civilizations that built in stone and wrote their histories in indelible ink. The past is also a mosaic of whispers, of echoes fading on the wind, of names spoken once and then swallowed by the vast, unforgiving silence of centuries. For every Caesar whose name is shouted through the ages, there are 100 kings and queens whose stories are buried deep, known only by a single line in a forgotten text, a fragment of pottery, a legend told by firesides far from the halls of power. Our hunger for these stories is a hunger for a truer, richer history. It is a desire to reassemble the mosaic, to listen for those whispers and give voice to those echoes. Today we venture into one of the most profound silences of the ancient world, to the wild and formidable steppes north of the Black Sea, to recover the story of a woman who should be a legend, but who remains for the most part a ghost. A ruler of such formidable will, strategic brilliance, and sheer power that she defied the expectations of her time, the decadence of her husband, and the aggression of a neighboring kingdom. Her name, as it has come down to us through a single fragile thread of history, is Amage. And this is her story. To understand Amage, we must first understand the world she was born into. We must leave behind the familiar marble columns of Rome and the philosophical schools of Athens. We must travel to a world of endless grass and immense sky, a landscape that does not merely host civilization but defines it. This is the Eurasian steppe, a vast corridor of land stretching from the borders of China to the gates of Europe. It is a harsh, beautiful, and demanding environment. Life here is mobile, resilient, and fiercely independent. The horse is not merely a tool, it is an extension of the self. The bow is not just a weapon, it is the guarantor of survival. From this environment emerged some of history's most formidable nomadic peoples: the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Huns, the Mongols. They were the perpetual shadow on the border of the settled world, the constant other, that both terrified and fascinated the so-called civilized empires of Persia, Greece, and Rome. The Sarmatians, the people Amage would come to rule, were a confederation of Iranian-speaking nomadic tribes. They were masters of the horse and the lance. Historians like Herodotus described their ancestors, the Scythians, and later writers noted the Sarmatians' distinct culture, including the awe-inspiring fact that their women fought alongside their men. The Greeks and Romans spoke of Amazons, and many scholars believe these myths were born from encounters with the warrior women of the steppes, women like Amage. These were not women playing at war, they were integral to the military and social structure of their people. They were raised from childhood to ride, to shoot, and to fight. Their society, out of sheer necessity, cultivated strength and ability wherever it could find it, regardless of gender. This is the cultural cradle of our story. A world where a woman taking command was not necessarily a shocking aberration, but could be a logical, if exceptional, response to crisis. Our window into Amage's life is narrow and singular. It comes to us from a Greek author named Polybius, who lived in the 2nd century AD, under the Roman emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. Polybius was not a historian in the modern sense. He was a Macedonian rhetorician who compiled a book called Stratagems of War, a collection of military tricks and cunning ploys used by famous generals and rulers throughout history. He dedicated it to the emperors on the eve of their campaign against the Parthians, perhaps as a handy guide for strategic thinking. It is in the 8th book of this work that we find chapter 56, simply titled Amage, the wife of Metasachus. This is it. This is the entire historical record upon which this queen's legacy rests. A few paragraphs in a book of war stories. Polybius's account is brief, matter-of-fact, and focused solely on her military stratagem. He leaves out her childhood, her personality, her inner life, her ultimate fate. He presents her as a fact, a problem solved with brilliant efficiency. For a historian, this is frustratingly scant evidence. For a storyteller, it is a lightning flash that illuminates a landscape for a single breathtaking second before plunging it back into darkness. We are left to piece together the rest from the context of her world, to breathe life into the skeleton that Polybius provides. The story as he tells it begins not with Amage, but with her husband, a Sarmatian king named Metasachus. Here we encounter our first challenge, for the name Metasachus itself is likely a Greek rendering of a Sarmatian name, its true meaning and sound lost to us. Polybius describes King Metasachus as a man who succumbed to a classic peril of power: decadence. He was, we are told, exceedingly luxurious and worthless. He abandoned the hardy nomadic virtues of his people for a life of pleasure and indulgence. He neglected his duties as a ruler, the administration of justice, the defense of the tribe's borders, the maintenance of alliances. As he sank into hedonistic torpor, the state began to fray at the edges. Injustice went unpunished. The borders grew porous and vulnerable. The respect of neighboring tribes began to erode. A power vacuum was developing, and nature, especially on the steppe, abhors a vacuum. Amage watched this decline. We can only imagine her frustration, her anger, her fear for her people. She was, according to Polybius, a woman of remarkable wisdom. This simple phrase suggests more than mere cleverness. It implies strategic understanding, political acumen, and a deep connection to the customs and needs of her people. She was not a passive observer. She saw the crisis unfolding and understood that her husband was either unwilling or unable to address it. So she took action. She did not stage a violent coup. She did not have him assassinated. Instead, she simply began to do the job he was neglecting. She assumed the responsibilities of command. She began to lead the armies, to drill the soldiers, to patrol the borders. She appointed herself Chief Justice, hearing disputes and rendering verdicts that were, by all accounts, fair and decisive. She became, in effect, the de facto ruler of the Sarmatians. The people and the soldiers, weary of their king's incompetence and inspired by Amage's capability and strength, willingly transferred their allegiance to her. They obeyed her commands and celebrated her leadership. Her husband, the worthless Metasachus, remained the king in title only, a hollow figurehead presiding over a court of indulgence while his wife ran the kingdom with iron competence. This was the first of her great stratagems, a bloodless, administrative takeover born not of raw ambition, but of necessity and a profound sense of duty. For a time this new arrangement worked. Amage's firm hand stabilized the kingdom. Justice was restored. The borders were secured. But the steppe was a volatile place and stability was always fragile. A new threat soon emerged from a neighboring region, the Crimean Peninsula. Crimea in this period was a fascinating cultural mix. Its southern and western coasts were dotted with wealthy ancient Greek colonies, city-states like Chersonesos and the Bosporan Kingdom. These were outposts of Hellenic civilization, rich from trade with vineyards and fisheries, and they often employed nomadic tribes as mercenaries or lived in a tense, symbiotic relationship with them. Polybius tells us that a king from one of these Crimean cities, whether a Greek ruler of a city like Chersonesos or a Hellenized native king is not entirely clear, began to launch raids into Sarmatian territory. This king, arrogant and aggressive, was violating a standing peace treaty between his people and the Sarmatians. He saw the Sarmatians as weakened under their luxurious king, and he sought to exploit that perceived weakness for plunder and territory. The raids were more than a mere nuisance. They were a direct challenge to Amage's authority and a threat to the safety of her people. Livestock was stolen. Outlying settlements were attacked. Subjects were killed or taken captive. As the ruler responsible for defense, Amage was compelled to act. Her first move was not military but diplomatic. She dispatched a formal embassy to the Crimean king. The messengers would have carried her stern warning: cease your raids immediately, honor the terms of the treaty, and withdraw from our lands. It was a clear and direct ultimatum from one ruler to another. But the Crimean king's response was one of utter contempt. He dismissed the embassy. He mocked the warning. Polybius suggests his arrogance was rooted in a deep-seated prejudice. He scorned the message specifically because it came from a woman. To him, Amage was not a legitimate ruler but a barbarian woman who had overstepped her natural place. Her authority was an insult to his own. He believed her threat was empty, the bluster of someone who could not possibly back it up with force. This was his critical and ultimately fatal miscalculation. He saw her gender, not her power. He saw her people as barbarians, not as masters of a form of warfare he could not comprehend. In his arrogance, he believed himself untouchable, safe behind the walls of his city or the strength of his own army. He could not have been more wrong. When the report of the king's contemptuous refusal reached Amage, she did not fly into a blind rage. She did not immediately muster the entire tribal army. A full-scale mobilization would have been slow, logistically complex, and would have given the enemy ample time to prepare. Instead, she responded with the cool, calculated precision of a master strategist. She devised a plan that was audacious, ruthless, and brilliant in its efficiency. This was to be her second and greatest stratagem, the one that would immortalize her in Polybius's book. She would not meet this king with the force of an army, but with the force of a perfectly executed idea. She summoned a small elite contingent of her very best warriors. Polybius gives us a specific number: 120 men. This was not an army, it was a surgical instrument. These would have been the finest horsemen and fighters among the Sarmatians, men chosen for their skill, their endurance, and their absolute loyalty to her. She gave them their orders. They were to travel light, carrying only their weapons and enough supplies for a hard, fast ride. Their objective was not to engage the enemy's army in the field, but to strike directly at the head of the snake. They were to ride for the king's own residence, his palace or fortified compound. The journey itself was a feat of incredible endurance. Polybius states that Amage led her 120 warriors on a forced march that covered a vast distance in a single day and night. The exact distance is lost, but the implication is one of superhuman effort, a ride that pushed men and horses to their absolute limit. This was a hallmark of nomadic warfare, unmatched mobility and speed. While settled armies moved slowly with their supply trains, a nomadic strike force could appear out of nowhere like a thunderclap from a clear sky. Imagine the scene. A small, determined band of riders thundering across the open steppe, then through the more settled lands of the Crimean coast, their pace unrelenting. They would have bypassed settlements, ignored outposts, their focus singular and absolute. They moved with the element of surprise as their primary weapon. The Crimean king, confident in his dismissal of Amage's threat, would have felt secure. His scouts, if he had any looking in the right direction, would not have reported the approach of a large army. He was unprepared for a lightning strike. They arrived at the king's compound under the cover of darkness or at first light. The text does not specify, but the element of surprise is paramount. The compound would have had guards, but they would have been lax, unprepared for an attack that seemed to come from nowhere. Amage and her warriors did not hesitate. They smashed through the outer defenses with the ferocity and momentum of their charge. The scene would have been one of utter chaos and terror for the defenders. The king's guards, startled from their posts, were quickly overwhelmed by the focused violence of Amage's elite band. This was not a battle, it was a blitzkrieg. Amage, fighting at the head of her troops, cut her way through to the inner chambers, directly toward the king himself. She found him, perhaps still in his private quarters, surrounded by his final, desperate bodyguards. There was no parley, no second chance for negotiation. She had given him his warning and he had squandered it. With ruthless efficiency, Amage killed the king where he stood. But her work was not finished. She had achieved her immediate military objective, but now she had to secure a political outcome. This is where Amage transitions from a mere warrior to a true stateswoman. She was not there for mindless slaughter or plunder. She was there to solve a problem. Having slain the arrogant king, she did not turn his compound into a charnel house. She did not kill his family or his courtiers. Instead, she gathered them. She then installed the king's son as the new ruler. This was a masterstroke. It prevented a bloody succession crisis that could have drawn her people into a prolonged conflict. It created a debt of gratitude from the new king to her. But it was not an act of mercy without conditions. It was an act of supreme political imposition. With the body of the old king likely still warm on the floor, Amage stood before the new young king and his terrified court. She laid down the law. She gave him a single, unequivocal command, a warning that was also a new treaty. He was to hold the kingdom not as his own possession, but as a gift from her. He was to rule justly. He was to honor all the treaties his father had broken. He was to never again raid Sarmatian lands. The price of disobedience was made terrifyingly clear. If he or any of his successors ever again transgressed against her people, the consequences would be the same. They would answer to her. The message was undeniable. The young king, shaken and humbled, agreed to her terms on the spot. The threat was over. The problem was solved. Amage had not just won a battle, she had engineered a lasting peace with a single terrifyingly effective act of violence and political theater. She then gathered her warriors, left the compound, and began the long ride home. She had accomplished her mission without a full-scale war, without a long siege, without depleting her own tribe's resources. It was a perfect, economical use of force. This incredible story leaves us with more questions than answers. What was the aftermath? Did the young king keep his word? History does not tell us. Polybius's interest ends with the successful stratagem. And what of Amage herself? What was her ultimate fate? Did she rule for many years after this event? Did her husband, Metasachus, ever try to reassert his authority? We do not know. She appears in our historical record in this one blinding flash of brilliance and then vanishes back into the darkness from which she came. This is the profound frustration and the captivating mystery of history's forgotten figures. We must also ask, why is she so unknown? The reasons are many. First, her story survives only in a single, non-historical source. Polybius was not writing a history of the Sarmatians. He was collecting an interesting anecdote about military cunning. Second, she was a woman of the steppes, a barbarian from the perspective of the literate, city-building civilizations that wrote the history books. The Greeks and Romans who chronicled their times often viewed nomadic peoples as fascinating but ultimately inferior, their stories not worth recording in the same detail as their own. Her greatness did not fit their narrative of civilization. Third, she left no monuments. Nomadic cultures of the steppes built with felt and wood, which decay. They did not erect pyramids or carve grand inscriptions in stone. Their history was oral, told in stories and songs around campfires, and those stories, like smoke, dissipated on the wind. Her legacy was not stone and ink, but fear and respect, which are far more ephemeral. So, who was the real Amage? Behind the stratagem, behind the title of queen, was a woman of profound complexity. We can speculate based on the context of her world. She was likely steeped in the culture of the steppe, a master horsewoman and archer from a young age. Her wisdom, as noted by Polybius, suggests a sharp intellect and a deep understanding of power dynamics. Her actions reveal a character of immense resolve, courage, and a fierce sense of justice. She was pragmatic, not needlessly cruel. She used exactly the amount of force required to achieve her goal and no more. She was a ruler who understood that true power lies not just in the ability to destroy, but in the ability to create a stable and lasting order from chaos. The story of Amage is more than a thrilling tale from the ancient world. It is a powerful reminder that history is infinitely deeper and more diverse than the standard textbooks allow. It challenges the traditional narratives that place men like Caesar and Alexander at the center of everything. It shows us that women have always been leaders, strategists, and wielders of immense power, even if the records have chosen to forget them. Her throne was not made of gold or marble. It was built on the respect of her warriors, the loyalty of her people, and the terrifying efficiency of her will. She is the quintessential throne unknown, a sovereign whose name deserves to be rescued from obscurity and placed alongside the great tactical minds of antiquity. She reminds us that greatness is not defined by the empire you build, but by the challenges you overcome and the legacy of strength and wisdom you leave behind, even if that legacy is whispered only in fragments. And so, the whisper of Amage, the queen of the Sarmatians, endures, a testament to a power that even the silence of centuries could not completely erase.